I am very excited about today's session because this is a topic that a lot of us work in here at the DCRI, and I think it's exciting to see the growth and the standardization of methods across our various projects. So really looking forward to hearing our speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Reed Johnson, who's professor of medicine and works here at the DCRI. He's a senior expert in the field of health application of stated preference methods and helped pioneer development of basic non-market valuation techniques in the 1980s. He also led the first FDA-sponsored study to quantify patients' willingness to accept benefit-risk trade-offs for new health technologies. Our second speaker is a new addition to the DCRI, Dr. Juan Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez joined Duke from RTI, where he worked for nearly 9 years in sponsored health preference research. His areas of expertise cover elicitation and analysis of stated preference data, and he's done work on patient and physician treatment preferences in oncology, dermatology, and vaccine preventable diseases. Finally, we'll be hearing from Dr. Shelby Reed, who's professor in the School of Medicine here at Duke. She's the director of the newly formed Preference Evaluation Research, or PREFER group here at DCRI. Her research has increasingly focused on stated preference studies to evaluate benefit-risk trade-offs, patient-centered value, and application to clinical decision-making, and she's currently serving as the president-elect of ISPOR. Please join me in welcoming our speakers for today.
So, from stories to evidence. So I have a little story to start out with. In 2005, a new biologic was approved for multiple sclerosis called Tysabri. It was fabulously effective, 66% reduction in multiple sclerosis symptoms and 90% reduction in lesions over 1 and 2 year periods. So 3 months after it was approved, it was withdrawn from the market because of 3 cases of PML, 2 of which died. A couple of weeks after the drug was removed from the market, I got a call from a guy named Steve Haas, who worked for Elan Pharmaceuticals, who was jointly marketing the drug with Biogen Idec. He said when they withdrew the drug from the market, their phones rang off the hook. Their email inboxes filled up. People were picketing outside the Biogen Idec offices, saying that we understand there's risks associated with this, but it's the only thing that's ever worked for me. Show me where I can sign to accept these risks. So he said, we can't go to FDA with stories like this. You know, like I was in a wheelchair, and after I took Tysabri, I got up and ran a marathon, stuff like that. But he said, is there any way to turn these stories into data, into evidence? And I said, I'm glad you asked. Because we've been trying to persuade pharmaceutical companies and FDA to think about quantifying patient preferences in a way that could be used in an evidence-driven healthcare system. And this was our first real opportunity to demonstrate that, in fact, this kind of data could be informative for clinical decision-making and regulatory evaluations. Okay, so we have a few objectives here. We just are going to try to introduce ourselves. Shelby knows everybody and knows, you know, the ages of their children. And but Juan Marcos and I are new. Juan Marcos is 1 week old, and I've been here kind of for a year or 2. So it's nice to be able to present ourselves and our group. We're going to give you a whirlwind overview of stated preference methods. We have been struggling for the last week or so because we want to say a lot more than we think you can absorb and we have time for anyway. And to show you a number of examples of how these methods have been used and can be used in various applications of medical decision making. All right, so our problem fundamentally is trying to compare apples to oranges, and this happens throughout healthcare. We've got multiple endpoints. There are multiple good things and bad things that happen, and we don't have any transparent, principled way to compare apples and oranges. We need plums or some other sort of metric or weighting system that allow us to combine all of these various disparate things into something that a single index or metric that can be used to compare outcomes in various ways. Now, the truth is that we make those value judgments all the time because we have to. Someone has to decide whether the benefits are greater than the risks or not, or comes up with some sort of scoring system for a PRO instrument. We do this all the time. But the weights that are assigned are inherently subjective, almost always are societal weights. That is, they're by people who are making decisions on the behalf of all of us. They are opaque. We have no idea what the basis for the comparisons are. And they're done by, well, who? Often by clinicians. Pretty much, traditionally, we have delegated this responsibility to clinicians. And so 5 of them sit around an FDA advisory committee, and at the end of 3 days of deliberations, someone says, okay, all those who think that the benefits exceed the cost, please raise your hand. And all those who think that the benefits exceed the risks, raise your hand. Or who's opposed. And there's no really discussion about, well, I think the weight that should be attached to this outcome is X. And then some other one says, no, I think it should be Y. That discussion is never recorded, but that discussion is going on in their heads because you have to attach weights in order to decide. All right. Well, that's fine. We delegate it to clinicians for good reasons. They're smart. They understand the facts and the science. And we think that people who understand that maybe we could give them the responsibility for making moral judgments for us too, I guess. Another group that weighs in on those moral judgments and ideological things in healthcare occasionally, and mostly annoyingly, are politicians. And at least, okay, they're elected people. If we don't like what they do, we can fire them. It's harder to fire the clinicians. Increasingly, there's been a discussion about whether patients should have a seat at this table, and in what way they should have a seat at the table, and what we would get from patients that would help define these values and weights. Now, it seems to me that there are good reasons for including patients. One is this widely accepted ethical principle of informed consent. I mean, we feel obligated to explain to patients what's going to be done with them and give them a chance to decide whether they want it or not, well, at certain points in the healthcare system. And the question is whether this general principle ought to apply more broadly. When I used to teach bonehead economics to undergraduates, my first lecture would be to explain to them the whole complete basis for modern neoclassical microtheory, which is this sort of value judgment that individuals are the best judge of their own welfare. This has nothing to do with psychology, okay? Economists accept this, and it's the whole basis for all of the theory and equations and modeling that they do. I never thought that this was very controversial. I didn't expect my students ever to push back. They wouldn't push back on the first day anyway, but when I started talking to clinicians, I heard a lot of stories about patients that made me question this fundamental postulate of economics. The question is whether people really are. But I am actually happy that this patient-centric movement has kind of revived this as a basic principle. All right. The day before Rob descended from Mount Sinai last week, his last pronouncement was an article that was published in JAMA that day, or the day before, where he says patient preferences are critical in determining when a product's benefits outweigh its risks, ... Now, I'm not going to tell you what's in the ... because I'm here to sell you movie tickets. All right. But Juan Marcos will fill in the dots later on. There are some caveats to this statement. Okay. But for now, I want you to accept this and go out and buy a movie ticket to the movie I'm about to explain to you. All right. There are different kinds of patient-reported data. We're talking about collecting data from patients, and I want to make sure you understand the difference between the kinds of patient data you're used to seeing and what the members of our group are doing in our research. So, some things that are quite familiar are the SF-36. This is quality of life or patient-reported outcome data. You get health-related quality of life scores from that. The methods that are used are Likert scales, dichotomous responses. There are different ways, but primarily Likert scores. And then applications are to measure efficacy and licensing. For PROs, it's for outcomes that can't be observed directly clinically. That is, we just ask people on the 10 smiley face score, how bad is your pain today? Because we'd like to measure it clinically, but we can't. It's a subjective evaluation. Now, there's something called QALYs, or cardinal utility. This is measured by instruments like the EQ5D. This produces a score between 0 and 1, where 0 is instantaneous painless death and 1 is perfect health. And so I'm not going to talk about this, and Shelby decided she wasn't going to talk about it. Oops. But the EQ5D comes up with a score, health state utility scores, and it's used in cost-effectiveness analysis, reimbursement decision-making. It's used in the UK systematically for evaluating new health technologies. Then there is stated preference methods that produce these relative importance weights that I've been trying to persuade you are very important. There are a number of different flavors of this. Two of the most common approaches are called best-worst scaling or discrete choice experiments. There are no standardized instruments. These are tailored instruments that are designed for each application. And they're used for benefit-risk analysis, calculating time equivalence, cost-utility analysis, and so on. We're going to focus, all three of us today are going to focus on what are called discrete choice experiments. This is a particular way of eliciting quantitative patient preferences. I'm going to have to pick up the pace here a little. What are preferences? Might be obvious to you, but let's make it clear. It's qualitative or quantitative statements of the relative desirability or acceptability of attributes that differ among alternative treatments. And I'm going to focus specifically on the quantitative. There's plenty of qualitative stuff that goes on, and FDA has been collecting qualitative data on patient preferences, but we're going to focus on how you can make what seems to be inherently a qualitative concept into a quantitative metric. All right. There is kind of an impression that this is new and unfamiliar and untested and weird, but the truth is that when Steve Haas called me, I could reach over and pull these methods right off a shelf, and they've been sitting on that shelf or being put on that shelf for 40 years. There's nothing we did on the Tysabri studies, we did 5 different studies for them, that was in any way innovative, except that we were doing it with health, we were doing it for an FDA submission, and that was very innovative. Anyway, these are, in its crude form, are just market research studies. It's Coke-Pepsi studies, except far more complicated and advanced than that. It's been used in transportation planning. It was used to design the BART light rail system in San Francisco, for example. I worked using it in environmental economics for 20 years. And more recently, but very importantly, it's been used in health. Dan McFadden got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2000 for his lifetime contributions. So this is not something that is dubious or lacking in either conceptual or statistical validity. All right, and we've gotten more attention because of patient-centered healthcare. All right, this is the question, the kind of question we ask people. This is from a recent study we did in psoriasis. This is not your standard public opinion survey. The respondents evaluate pairs or triplets of constructed treatments where we vary systematically the characteristics or the outcomes or the endpoints of those treatments, and then they choose. If you had to face this actual choice in real life, what would you choose? Okay. So this approach is also known as choice-based conjoint analysis. I'm in one markers this way. As I showed you, the alternatives consist of combinations of features. Preferences depend on the relative importance. That is, in order for people to answer that choice question, they've got to attach weights to those different outcomes. And we ask these questions in a patterned way. They answer 10 to 12 of these questions. And their pattern of choices, if we're clever enough with the design of the study, reveals the implicit weights that they're attaching to each of those things. That's what we're trying to get after. Okay. 4 steps. I'm going to go through each one of them really quickly. I'm going to have to really hustle here. All right. So first you have to identify the endpoints. We can either get these from clinical trial data. That's kind of the top-down approach. Or some people are advocating, first of all, that the trial endpoint should be defined by patients, not by clinicians. Anyway, the bottom up is to go out and ask patients what's important and use those to define the constructs that we're going to evaluate. Here is the list of attributes and levels for the psoriasis study. We have 2 different kinds of efficacy, 2 different kinds of risks, and there was a convenience factor, a dosing regimen. All right. Now we have to develop a survey. Once there's consensus on the study team and the ultimate user of the study, what the endpoints should be, we have to write very clear 6th grade English definitions. And this is where the sparks fly between the preference researchers and the clinicians who are unhappy with the fact that we're not using precise clinical language that hardly any of our respondents would be able to understand. So the idea is that we have to come up with an explanation that ordinary people can understand and evaluate. And it requires a bit of compromise on both sides until we finally come to definitions which we think are both clinically accurate and understandable to the respondents. Then we have to design these choice tasks. So we have to lay out exactly what graphics we're going to use and the colors, and we sweat blood over this part because we think that making it really easy for people to make the comparisons improves the quality of the data that we get, reduces the measurement error. And then we take it to actual patients, sit across the table from them, have them think aloud as they take the survey, and then we go back to the drawing board. It doesn't matter how, I've done hundreds, I don't know how many I've done, lots of these studies. And I go into these patient interviews thinking, we don't really need to do this. This looks like a great survey to me. And sure enough, it doesn't work. In some way or another, in multiple ways, it doesn't work. And we have to go back and fix it. And that can take several rounds before we get it right. I'm not going to talk to you much about experimental design, but then you have to come up with all of the questions, that is the layouts that give you all the contrasts between pairs or triplets of these are hypothetical combinations. And that experimental design is what makes it possible to tease out the implicit preference weights statistically. All right, I'm not going to talk about this. Then we've got to go out and find patients. At Duke, we have great opportunities to recruit patients in lots of different therapeutic areas if you can get past the bureaucracy, which seems to be a major challenge. But nevertheless, I think there's far more potential than in any setting where I've worked in to do really high-quality patient interactions and collect high-quality data. And I'm not going to talk about estimation either. So this is what the choice model estimates look like for psoriasis. I'm not going to explain this to you, but you're going to see this chart a few more times later. I'm going to quickly take a, I'm sorry, I've got to catch up. I'm over my fair share of the time. So here's an application. I'm sorry, we're going to look first at, we're going to look at examples over the full product life cycle, from discovery to its actual clinical application. And we've got an example and some stories to tell about each of these stages in which we think that stated preference data can be useful. I had this quote here. Originally, Shelby and I thought a good title for this presentation would be, "Your Patient-Centered Medical Decision-Making Problem Looks Like a Nail to Us." We think that there are opportunities at every stage of product development to engage patients and quantify their preferences so that it fits into the kinds of decision-making at each stage. All right. So here is the preference estimates for a study we did on Fragile X syndrome. We did this for Genentech. Genentech had some molecules that they thought looked promising for treating symptoms of Fragile X, which is a genetic developmental disorder. So we used in this case, we constructed the attributes from a staging algorithm for determining the severity of Fragile X symptoms. And so these are various domains. Okay, so we got these. These represent relative preference weights. The vertical axis has no meaning. It's just the vertical. There we go. The vertical distance here between the best and the worst outcome for each of these domains represents the relative importance of that domain. Okay? And we're just going to arbitrarily define that particular distance. The biggest distance is 10, and everything is going to be relative to that. All right. So the clinicians had decided, based on who knows what, that the most important outcomes for Fragile X patients were learning to apply new skills. I guess I had a point with this. Learning to apply new skills and take part in new social activities. That is, dealing with changes. These Fragile X patients find it very difficult to do that. And so if we could fix that, that would result in a huge improvement in the quality of the patients' lives and of their caregivers. It turns out that they were quite wrong. In fact, the caregivers picked, based on the caregivers' preferences, it was control your own behavior and care for self. That is self-care, self-management, which were roughly twice as important as the clinicians' endpoints. Well, it turns out that this created, in this case, the sponsor shared with us some of the inner machinations that occurred. This created a huge problem in their development strategy. And there were those who argued, no, we're not going to pay any attention to those caregiver preferences. We think that it's these other things that are important. But it turned out, finally, that they ditched the program that they had committed themselves to and instead focused on molecules that they thought would reach these endpoints. All right. I'm going to move on. I'm going to skip over the composite endpoints and give you Juan Marcos. Other.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, so let's try to go through these as quickly as possible. Benefit risk evaluations. Rita has already mentioned this term several times, and I think it's not surprising that patient preferences and the use of stated preference methods has been so widely used in this area. And so this is the rest of the quote that Reed presented earlier. I guess what I wanted to say here was that patient preferences in benefit risk evaluations, it's a natural fit, and it certainly hasn't surprised our very own Rob Califf that we have been relying so much more on these methods in recent times. And actually, he is very encouraged by what he's seen and has encouraged in this very recent publication to further pursue the use of this and other methods to be able to incorporate patient views in the regulatory process. Now, there are two main ways in which this has happened at FDA. The first one is the route that the Center for Drugs has followed, which involves a series of meetings that started back in 2013, and they brought together different stakeholders, obviously including patients, and they've discussed 20 plus disease areas that are listed here, and particularly how does patient preference, or how can patient preference be used and incorporated into the drug development process and drug approval process. Now, the second path is the path that has followed CDRH, the Center for Devices, and to us this is a more interesting path because they have just recently issued guidance, and it's kind of a big deal because it's the first time that a regulatory agency has issued a document like this, where they have provided some clear sense that they are willing to incorporate and consider preference information to supplement the clinical information that they get in the submission process. We like it also because they explicitly mention stated preference methods as a way to capture that information and turn those perspectives into evidence. And of course, CDRH didn't take the process of drafting this guidance very lightly at all. Their rationale is based on principles that come from both economics and decision sciences. Very, very quickly, you can think of the principles behind the ideas in this guidance as follows. You can imagine that there are a series of devices, right? And each one of these devices has its own profile of benefits and risks. Some of these devices will seem very appealing because they provide a great deal of benefit but are associated with very low levels of risks. On the other end of that spectrum, you have the converse, right? Devices that might have a profile that includes very low levels of efficacy but are associated with very high levels of risks. And so in those extreme examples, it's pretty obvious, what the decision ought to be as they're evaluating submissions for the approval of these devices. Where it gets tricky is where you look at the middle of the bunch here, right? And so if you have enough information, historical data that shows what has been approved and what hasn't, you can start to look at those decisions and start to infer what is sort of the threshold that the regulators have used to make these determinations about the relative impact of benefits and risks, right? And so based on that, you can start then look beyond what history has to offer and start looking into what the future might involve in terms of approval of new products that, for which we have a different profile of benefits and risks. Now, the issue, of course, is that the patient's perspectives might be different from that of the regulators. And so it could be different in a not so meaningful way where you have a threshold that qualitatively doesn't really change any of the approval decisions that you've seen historically, but it could be, there could be meaningful deviations, right? And so in such a situation, what you have is approval of devices or products that may not represent sort of a net benefit when you consider benefits and risks for patients, or perhaps what is a little bit more troublesome, the rejection of certain devices that could have been helpful to patients, right? So FDA decided, CDRH in particular, that they wanted to look into how they could use stated preference methods to infer or come up with that threshold and understand from patients what was the relationship of benefits and risks of weight loss devices. And so there are a few devices already out there, very few that have been approved for weight loss. And they were concerned. I mean, we all know that it's a pretty serious public health issue. So they wanted to have the patient perspective and understand how these methods could be used to incorporate that patient perspective into their decisions. I'm going to skip very quickly. And I'm going to start talking specifically about the study they sponsored. This is a study that was actually led by Reed Johnson. I was part of the group that conducted the study as well. And it used a discrete choice experiment to evaluate the relative importance of different attributes of weight loss devices. Now, obviously, FDA was particularly interested in this relationship of benefits and risks. So one of those attributes was efficacy in the form of percentage weight loss. The other one was the one you see here at the end of this chart to the right, which is mortality risk. Now, let me explain a little bit how you interpret this graph. So on the horizontal axis, you have the different attributes that were included in the study. You can think of the attributes as sort of broad categories of outcomes, right? And the levels that were presented within each of the attributes. And so we have sort of a menu of levels that, as Reed mentioned, are presented in these choice questions. And through the trade-offs that we observe people making in the choice questions, we can infer how important certain changes are relative to, in one attribute or one dimension, relative to other changes in other dimensions. The vertical axis represents the preference or importance weights. The value, again, as Reed mentioned, of the points themselves has no interpretable meaning, but the vertical distance between them within an attribute does. So once we collected the data and we were able to get these results, which, not surprisingly, showed us that increases in weight loss were strictly preferred, and increases in mortality risk were actually quite harmful and impactful. We were able then to bring the impact or translate the impact of weight loss changes from these hypothetical devices and contrast that against an equivalent impact or change in the increase of the mortality risk associated with the device, right? And so that equivalence is what we call maximum acceptable level of risk. It is an indication of risk tolerance because it basically states that for a specific level of efficacy, people are willing to trade off X amount of risk. Now, obviously, the trade-offs and the tolerance depends on the type of efficacy and the type of risk. But it does provide some way to quantify those relationships. You can also look at it backwards and start from the risk changes associated with a device and start thinking about if a device is associated with a specific level of risk, how much benefit or how much efficacy does this device need to offer patients in order to provide sort of a net positive impact. Now, another thing that we did with this study that is sort of reflected here in the middle of these two attributes is we included all sorts of other things that described not only the amount of weight loss that patients would receive with the device, but also how the device would be implanted, what kind of side effects they would have, how long would the weight loss be maintained, and all sorts of other things, what kind of improvement they could expect to receive in terms of comorbidities. And so all of these things provide a context to that relationship between benefits and risk. So it's not just evaluating how much weight loss do I get versus how much risk of mortality I'm willing to accept. It's how much benefit do I get, how do I get it, what is involved in getting that benefit, and how does that translate into risk tolerance, okay? Now you can imagine I can actually create profiles of devices based on the preference weights that I've calculated here. I can take for each one of these attributes a preference weight and take that as a representation of the impact of a particular device under that particular dimension, and then aggregate or add to that an additional piece of information on the impact of all the other attributes that we're including. So you can create a huge number of profiles just grabbing one point from each one of these dimensions. And so in order to make the process of evaluating all sorts of profiles more easily for FDA, we decided to create this tool. And what this tool does is that it's just an Excel-based tool. It's pretty simple, really. But it allowed the users to specify the characteristics of the device they are evaluating based on, again, the dimensions that were included in the study and the levels they assume the device would have under each one of those. We also allow them to specify sort of the baseline conditions of the patient. So what's their initial weight of the patient? And through this tool, we were able to provide information on both the maximum acceptable level of risk that the patients will be willing to accept for the profile described here, or the minimum acceptable level of benefit that they would require to offset whatever mortality risk is considered in the profile. We did something that is, I think, very important, particularly for the next slide that I'm going to present, is that we also, because we are able to collect information from each individual, we collect a series of questions for each individual, we're actually able to identify whether and how patients for specific outcomes, preferences for specific outcomes change across the patients in the sample. So we not only get a sense of what is sort of the average risk tolerance in the sample, but we can also start talking about how does that change across patients, and what's the distribution of risk tolerance look like. And the reason that is exciting is because months or maybe a year or so after we concluded this study, the FDA released this information where they announced that for the first time they had used preference information in the review of this device called the Maestro Rechargeable System for weight loss. And what they stated in the press release was that a few interesting things. Number one, that the device actually didn't meet its original endpoint, but that with information that they collected through the patient preference study and evidence they had through the trial on other aspects that they were interested in, they decided to approve the device anyway. And one of the things they alluded to was the idea that even if the average patient would not receive necessarily a positive benefit from having this device or making available this device, the distribution, what they knew about the distribution of preferences, what they knew about the distribution of risk tolerance, told them that a meaningful number of patients could benefit from having access to this device. And so it's very cool, obviously, for us to see that this information has been applied, at least in this example. I know of at least 2 other studies right now that are related to submissions to FDA in the device side of the FDA. And so they're looking into this very same information. They're looking into risk tolerance and perhaps more importantly into understanding how that risk tolerance varies across respondents or across patients. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to let Shelby now continue. I guess you will need this.
I think so. I have there.
All right, thank you. All right, so I'm going to finish up talking about the last 3 phases that we want to talk with you about today. And these last 3 phases are we don't have as much experience in, and they're somewhat looking forward as to how they could be applied. So in terms of value frameworks, there's been a great deal of interest in evaluating the costs and the benefits of new technologies over the last couple of years. So the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology actually were the first out of the gate, stating that they were going to evaluate cost-effectiveness analyses that have been published and use those when making qualitative statements about value for new technologies that are covered in practice guidelines. And then in 2015, we saw 3 groups put out value frameworks around cancer care. And so I'll touch on those in just a moment. And then the ICER group is using traditional cost-effectiveness analysis. This indicates when they released their cost-effectiveness analysis on PCSK9 inhibitors. Faster Cures is an advocacy group specifically around rare diseases. They've worked with Avalere Health to put out another value framework. And then there's a big initiative at ISPOR really trying to take a principled look at these different value frameworks and put one forward. So as I mentioned, these groups, and there's also the second panel on cost effectiveness, that issued updated guidelines on conducting cost-effectiveness analyses. So, this is what I've traditionally done in my 16 years here at the DCRI is cost-effectiveness analysis, in which we evaluate the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio as the difference in cost divided by the difference in effectiveness, where effectiveness is measured using a QALY, which is a composite of improvements in survival and accounting for quality of life during that survival period. Okay? These are pretty well-established methods. Then we look to the cancer frameworks, and we can see ASCO's framework is represented here, and this is their scoring rubric, and they have intended for this framework to be used to help facilitate physician and patient decision-making in the clinic, okay? And these you're supposed to take a given treatment and go through and assign these scores. Okay, so ultimately these scores for clinical benefit, toxicity, and bonus points get added up, and one has a net health benefit score. But there's really no empirical basis for these weights, and then the cost per month is provided, and the patient and physician are supposed to determine whether that's a good value or not based on this score. Okay, the drug abacus that was put together by Peter Bach up at Memorial Sloan Kettering is represented here. And in this case, they ask the user to go through and identify what's the value of a life year. It can range from $12,000 to $300,000 per year. There's a toxicity discount that can range from 10 to 30%. And then there are these multipliers that are used. They range from 1 to 3, and they represent whether the drug has a novel mechanism of action, whether it's used for a rare disease, the burden of the condition in the population, and then whether it costs a lot to develop it. Like that should be considered in the value of the medicine and its appropriate price. So the way this is used is that users are supposed to select their dollars per life year in all of these multipliers, and the red and green dots represent the abacus price. Okay, that's the appropriate price, monthly price for the drug, and the gray dots represent the actual price. So when these multipliers are all 1, you can see that in most cases the actual price surpasses the appropriate drug abacus price. And then this is just to show that these multipliers are critically important. If you set them all to 2, you can see the results have totally changed. And actually, we should be paying much more for our oncology drugs than we are. Okay? So some of the examples here are that we should be paying maybe $54,000 per month for treatment with Gleevec, okay, as opposed to its actual price of about $10,000 per month. So again, just to say that these weights are very important. The second panel is also looking beyond the QALY to capture different benefits from drug therapies. And then as part of the ISPOR initiatives, and there are several other initiatives out there looking hard at value frameworks, they're considering other aspects of value that should be considered when evaluating drugs. These might include options values. So I may not need a treatment today, I may not need an antibiotic today, but I value the fact that it's available in case I need it. Okay? There's value in that. There's the value of knowing with diagnostics. The value of hope is something that's often talked about with cancer patients. Very important to consider. Impact on others, particularly family members and caregivers, and dosing regimens. So this is all to say that these stated preference methods provide one means of generating the weights that can be applied to these different features of value. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is the use of these weights in comparative effectiveness research and in evidence reviews. Jillian's not here, but she made a statement last week when we were in a meeting. She said, yeah, we do all these evidence reviews, and we come up with a table, and we have a table representing benefits and a table representing risks or harms, and how do we pull them all together? Okay, so you can see in this review of evidence reviews that aggressive screening for diabetes versus standard screening for diabetes has no impact on all-cause mortality, but does have a reduction in the risk of non-fatal MI, but also shows that there's an increase in the risk of severe hypoglycemia. Okay? So how do we balance those benefits and harms? Okay? I'm going to propose that we can do that with these stated preference methods. This is our hammer that Reed referred to. Okay, so we did a study with collaborators at University of Pennsylvania on a PCORI-funded project. We were looking at doing a comparative effectiveness analysis of TNF-alpha inhibitors or prolonged use of corticosteroids in patients with Crohn's disease. So TNF-alpha inhibitors are more effective, okay, in terms of increasing the amount of time that patients spend in remission. They also allow patients to avoid prolonged use of steroids, and compared to prolonged corticosteroids, they have lower risk of infection, okay? But they might have a higher risk of cancer. So this study was undertaken to elicit patient preferences. We conducted a discrete choice experiment where efficacy was measured in terms of duration and disease severity. We accounted for how many months a patient had to take steroids over a given year. And then we accounted for the risk of serious infection, cancer, and the risk that a patient might have emergency surgery for Crohn's disease. Okay, so Juan Marcos mentioned that we can measure things in terms of risk as our numeraire, the maximum acceptable risk. We can also use time as the common metric. And in this case, we calculated remission time equivalence, where we offset risks for time with remission. And we applied those preference weights to a comparative effectiveness analysis that was actually done using Medicare and Medicaid claims. And there was also a Markov model that was built to allow for sensitivity analysis. And we applied those weights to account for not only the benefits of TNF-alpha inhibitors, but also its harms. We showed that, in fact, TNF-alpha inhibitors were net benefit, okay, to these patients. So, what is unique here? We could have used a QALY framework where we would have applied utility decrements to the harms that patients experienced. But what we were able to do here is that there was this perception that TNF-alpha inhibitors increase the risk of cancer. Okay? We actually found that they didn't in the comparative effectiveness analysis, but what the remission time equivalents allow us to incorporate is the fact that all of the patients exposed to TNF-alpha inhibitors bared that risk, bared the perception that there was a risk of cancer, okay, even though very few people did. If we had applied that in a QALY framework, only a handful of patients might have had that utility decrement applied. But here we get to apply for the fact that everyone is bearing that risk and the perceptions of that. Okay? But I also want to point out, and Juan Marcos alluded to this, is that people have different preferences. Some people are more risk tolerant than others. And as stated preference researchers are increasingly using methods like latent class analysis, we do find that people have different preferences. And so what is represented here are 3 latent classes that were represented in the data that we got from the Crohn's disease discrete choice experiment. Okay? The majority of patients are represented in the efficacy class, represented by the orange bars. Okay? And then there's also, didn't mean to do that, the steroid class, and those are people who desperately want to avoid use of steroids. Okay? So they're willing to give up quite a bit of time in remission to avoid steroids. And then we have the patients represented by the green bar who are very risk averse. They're very concerned about the cancer risk. Okay? So now we can go back and apply their remission time equivalent weights to that comparative effectiveness comparison between TNF-alpha inhibitors and corticosteroids. And in fact, we showed that even in the risk-averse group, when we applied that, the decrement for people bearing the risk of cancer, that TNF-alpha inhibitors were found to be superior over prolonged use of corticosteroids for each of those classes. Now that won't always be the case. Okay, we'll find other times where the benefit-risk trade-off isn't the same for each group of patients. Okay, and that leads me to the last part, which is the use of these methods for eliciting an individual patient's preferences, and how can we bring that to decision making. Okay, so there are lots of practice guidelines that mention patient preferences and how important they are. But there's very little guidance on how to elicit those preferences or how they should be used. So we have the new guidelines for breast cancer screening, indicating that women under 50 should consider the potential benefit and the potential harms of screening. Okay? Don't know how they're supposed to do that. Also for ovarian cancer, when considering use of neoadjuvant chemotherapy or surgery first for ovarian cancer, patients must be allowed to express their goals and their preferences. Again, how to do that is the question. So what we're proposing is that we deliver personalized medicine. We consider the medical evidence that's available, that's tailored to an individual's age, comorbidities, and so forth. But we also consider individual patient preferences and have a discussion in the clinic that will help patients make these difficult decisions. So for a few years now, we've been working with Chad Mather here at DCRI. He's an orthopedist, and working on an application in first-time shoulder dislocation. So these patients, they can have surgery, and if they have surgery, it'll reduce the risk that they will have a repeat dislocation. But they have to undergo invasive surgery. They have to take time away from their sport, and many individuals who get this particular injury are athletes, and they have to limit their shoulder mobility while they're recovering from the surgery. So there are these different considerations as to whether these individuals should be directed to surgery or a course of physical therapy. Okay? So we set up what is known as an adaptive choice-based conjoint, where individuals go through and they consider different scenarios, and they're supposed to indicate whether they prefer one or the other and how strongly. And this, there's an adaptive algorithm that is applied so that the next set of questions that they see, or the next array of attribute levels that they see, are dependent on the way they answered to previous questions. So over a series of questions, we can infer what is most important to an individual patient. Okay, so based on, this was a web-based sample of 374 individuals, and we found that the most important attributes were out-of-pocket costs and the chance of another shoulder dislocation. Okay, not so surprising. But then what we also see is that there are differences across individual patients. Okay, and to use those in decision making requires that we have something available that can be used before a patient gets to the clinic. So what we developed was an app that collected information on the individual patient's demographics, other contextual variables like what kind of sports they participated in, whether they would be willing to give up or limit those sports, and then they engaged in the adaptive choice-based exercise to elicit their preferences. And then that was combined with a decision analysis that used medical evidence to determine the risk of recurrence based on an individual patient's age and gender and activity level. Okay? So that information was pulled together. And what's represented is the bottom is the patient output. This is what they saw. And then they were asked whether they wanted to share it with their doctor. If they were willing to share it with their doctor, and then they could, and they would engage in a discussion there. So we believe that there are a number of benefits for these methods, these individualized preference elicitation tools for patients. They're going to be more informed because as part of doing these surveys, they get these nice descriptions about the different attributes and features that they should consider, but it also engages them in the decision-making process. They really start to think about it. Decisional conflict scales are often used to measure the effectiveness of different decision tools. And I argue, and so do others, that we believe that decision conflict should probably increase for a lot of medical decisions. Because when decision conflict's very low, because people really haven't thought about the trade-offs or don't understand the trade-offs that are involved. We also think it will lead to improvements in patient-clinician decision-making and communication. We hope that by delivering or helping to deliver patient-centered care, they're more satisfied. And if they're receiving the treatments that they want to receive, they'll ultimately adhere more to the treatment and ultimately have better patient outcomes. Okay? From the healthcare system perspective, there's also opportunities to increase the efficiency of medical care delivery. So in that case, if a patient really was better suited for a course of physical therapy, they might not ever go to the surgeon for a consultation. Okay? So it will help with triage. And then also, particularly in a capitated system where healthcare systems might be incentivized to provide fewer medical procedures or services, we can actually use these preference elicitation tools to document that we are delivering patient-centered care. And it's appropriate for that patient not to undergo the more invasive procedure. So, it provides the hospitals a justification for changes in practice patterns. We're working on different applications. Actually, we just had a meeting this morning with Shelly Huang where we're looking at treatment decisions around DCIS, ductal carcinoma in situ, as to whether a woman should undergo active surveillance or lumpectomy or mastectomy. Okay? Over 10 years, there's very, very little difference in breast cancer survival with those alternative courses. Yet there are huge implications for a woman who undergoes these surgeries and sometimes radiation, sometimes undergoes hormonal therapy with prolonged pain and prolonged symptoms. So these are important decisions that may ultimately help drive practice as well. So this is our team, the three of us that are presenting today. We also have two excellent consultants right now working with us, Ray-Jen Yang at the bottom and Angie Fairchild at the top. And then this also represents a host of our clinical collaborators that we've worked with over the last couple of years. So we're working with more and more people around Duke, and we'd be happy to extend the invitation if you have something you'd like to talk about. We'd be happy to meet with you to talk about how we could use these new methods, well, not new methods, these methods in your research. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a very interesting presentation. I have a question about cognitive burden. So we know from behavioral economics that people in general are not very good at understanding risk and probabilities. How do we make sure that these surveys ask questions that are understandable enough and also ensure that stated preferences translate into revealed preferences and actual behavior in the real world?
Okay, well, there are actually two questions there.
So the first one we anticipated. We know that people have difficulty with numeracy and with understanding risks. So we take a lot of effort to try to help kind of level the playing field. We include what we call a risk tutorial to show them what represents a 1% risk, and we phrase it as 1 out of 100, we show it as 1%, and we use the risk array that was shown in our choice questions. So we use all those to help people understand the level of risks. And we also know there are a lot of heuristics that are often used in decision making. And we see that when patients go through these choice questions, they may initially rely on some heuristic, but we can see them start to think and try to weigh the benefits and risks more carefully as they go through the survey. So, kind of taking Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, or thinking slow and fast, we try to move them from thinking fast to thinking slow. So we can even see when we're analyzing the data, there may be more measurement error in the first couple of questions, but then they often do, 8, 9, 10, or even 12 of these, and we can see that over time there's a bit of a learning curve. So it's something that we do take seriously and we want to understand so we can try to reduce any potential bias. As to how well these methods represent revealed preferences when people are given choices, that's an area of active research. And it is difficult to find cases where truly patients have different options that are equally applicable to an individual. The reason that we do these types of studies is that we can look across a wide range of possible devices, that have all these different characteristics. Where in the real world, there might be only 2 devices that apply. And maybe an insurance company only pays for one of them. So it's really hard for a person to reveal their preferences without being influenced by so many structural features in the system. So it's quite challenging. But we're always looking for opportunities that if we can actually evaluate revealed preferences where choices are available and there aren't many constraints on those choices, we'd love to do a study to compare stated preferences and revealed preferences.
Sorry, we're over time. We had a lot to present, so thanks for your attention.